Blackouts in the Moscow region, destroyed power plants near Moscow, strikes on Moscow and St. Petersburg, the Moscow and Leningrad regions, strikes on railway hubs and power plants. All of this is the work of the armed forces of Ukraine, the defense forces. Let's discuss the prospects of destroying the Russian economy. Moscow and St. Petersburg left without power. These are massive strikes, blackouts, attacks on airfields like Diaghilevo and others. With the well-known journalist Alesya Batsman right now, I'm very glad to see you, especially today.
Dasha, hello friends, I'm glad to see you too.
Tell me, please, did you expect at all that Trump would decide to impose sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, and that President Zelensky would announce that as soon as tomorrow we might have crypto moguls?
Of course, Dasha, not only did I expect it, but you and we've been talking about exactly this from broadcast to broadcast. To say that President Trump is on the same path as us. And this path leads to sanctions, powerful sanctions against Russia, and to America providing Ukraine with the most powerful weapons. There are no other options, no other path for President Trump or for us. And in fact, as a result of all this, Putin also has only one path left. Look, we've always discussed this issue with you for so long. We've talked about the fact that we don't know when this will happen, because logically everything will develop and move forward just as it has been. So we didn't predict all of this, but we did analyze it. But as for when and how all of this will happen, we are the witnesses. We are living in this historic time. That's why the fact that Donald Trump has now imposed sanctions. By the way, notice that even President Biden didn't introduce such powerful sanctions, because we often say, well, there's Biden and those sanctions and those, he was against Russia. But Trump, I've heard this opinion from many people. Oh, Trump, they say he likes Putin. He feels sorry for Russia. He won't impose sanctions. But just look at what's happening. Biden never imposed such sanctions against Russia. Why are they important? Because Lukoil and Rosneft are two leaders, two giants, two locomotives of the Russian economy, because they are two powerful pillars, the two legs of Russia's oil industry, what it stands on, what supports and drives it. Biden imposed sanctions on companies lower down, the ones that don't have a critical impact on the market, but these two do. These are the two companies that Trump sanctioned. Next, let's break down what's actually happening in this area, because we'll quickly go through this crash course. To wage war, Russia needs money. It gets money from several sources. But the main, the largest, the most critical source of money is energy resources, the oil and gas sector. And it's precisely this sector that Trump has already started targeting. He's not going to target it. He's already started. What is he doing? Let's analyze what's happening. Well, first of all, it all started with Ukraine strikes, and we understand that these are not just Ukraine strikes, but are carried out entirely in coordination with the help of our Western partners. Deep inside Russia, targeting energy facilities. As a result, the so-called world's gas station, as everyone calls Russia, stopped being one in just a few days, and there were even huge lines for gasoline. Next, we see that all across Europe, here and there, strange things are happening to facilities that deal with Russian oil or gas. We see it, of course we do. The next point. Even before the sanctions, even against Lukoil and Rosneft, we see that China and India, Trump, are being pressured to give up Russian oil. And this is an absolutely critical issue. They are the largest buyers. But after Trump imposes these unprecedented sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, information comes in that China and India are refusing. Moreover, they are already starting to sign contracts because negotiations had been going on before this. They understood that it would all come to this, and they would have to reorient themselves and leave the Russian market. They are already looking elsewhere to other countries and signing contracts there. Next point. What Trump promised during his election campaign. We remember, drill, baby, drill. Drill, baby, drill. And that's exactly what they're doing now. Look, Last night, there was news that Donald Trump is allowing the extraction, the production of energy resources along the entire American shelf, wherever they are found. This is basically a revolution, right? A revolution that will bring what? Well, first of all, it will bring super profits, big earnings for the USA, not just for certain businessmen, but also for the state budget. Indeed, it will increase America's prosperity, and it will give Ukraine a stronger position while leaving Russia without money. And now I'm saying the key point. It will leave Russia without money. And what does it mean to leave Russia without money? It means that Putin will no longer be able to continue the war, at least not on the same scale as it is now. Look, let's break it down. It's no coincidence that Trump mentioned this when Putin said no sanctions will affect us. All these sanctions supposedly don't bother us at all. Wonderful. And what did Trump reply to him? Well, let's talk about it in 6 months. Wonderful too. We'll see. Why 6 months? Because in reality, for Putin to actually feel the effects of these sanctions and the lack of money, some time has to pass. In fact, 6 months is nothing at all. It's just a moment. But what happens if Putin runs out of money that he's currently spending on the war? First of all, they're paying huge sums to the contract soldiers. These really are huge amounts, tens of thousands of dollars. Even now, without these latest decisions from Trump, we can see that in some regions, Russia is already starting to retroactively reduce payments to these contract soldiers. 2, 3, 4, even 8 times in some regions. So they're already basically cheating them retroactively. They signed up and sold their lives for one amount, and now they're being told, no, it'll be 8 times less. But it's still a lot of money. Every day this army needs to be maintained. If that money runs out, then what needs to be done? Stop paying altogether, transfer everyone from contracts, in essence, mobilize them, and then to get new cannon fodder, you have to announce a general mass mobilization. Next point. And how do you keep producing weapons? Because to wage war, you need a certain amount of drones, missiles, tanks, and whatever else. Then that costs a lot of money. And look, the military-industrial complex that Putin launched, the defense industry, it has to keep ramping itself up. It needs to receive government contracts. There are already a huge number of people working there who are used to getting much higher salaries than in other non-military sectors. And this too, well, it's all interconnected. Everything is tied to everything else. So this sets things in motion. Yes, it really does stimulate the Russian economy, because when those working at these enterprises receive money, they can spend it and, again, inject it back into the economy, buy things, and so on. Travel somewhere, spend money, and so on and so forth. Pay taxes. When this doesn't happen, everything stops. When this doesn't happen, the front comes to a halt. When this doesn't happen, the enterprise stops operating. When this doesn't happen, the enterprise goes bankrupt. Loans stop being issued and food riots begin. And here, this is already quite literal. Because in order to keep living, to keep functioning, and especially to wage war, you need to get money from somewhere. And here, Putin is faced with a choice. But frankly, the choice is not great. So where do you get the money? Well, if this main oil and gas flow stops, then there's the simplest way, just like in Soviet times. They're used to using it, taking it away from the population. All right, they'll take it away. They'll take it away. They'll seize all the bank deposits. They'll take everything that was ever kept anywhere. We remember how everything our parents had in their savings books just vanished back in those days. And nothing happened. The state robbed everyone. And what did anyone do about it? Who went to jail for that? When someone steals a wallet on a bus, the thief might get caught and end up in jail. But here, on a national scale, everyone was robbed. Theft. When people saved up their whole lives, the theft was just unbelievable. Not only did no one go to jail, but they ended up in presidential chairs, in prime minister's seats, and so on. So in fact, everything happened the other way around. Right now, it's the same situation. The authorities themselves will be taking the money. That's why everyone in Russia who is listening to us or watching right now should think about this. If they have money sitting in banks somewhere, they need to urgently withdraw it and move it out. Otherwise, it will simply be taken by the state. The next point is pensions. Pensions will stop being paid because even now they're already saying it. You can see how they're preparing for it. Like, what's the point? First of all, they want to raise the retirement age so that retiring basically means going straight to the grave. So they don't have to feed these pensioners anymore. So they'll do that. But as a last resort, Putin will consider taking money from his own oligarchs. Like, you supported us back in the day when you got rich. Basically, you took all this from the state, right? You got fat off of it. That's enough. Come on, give it back. And here I have a big question. Which of the oligarchs would actually want to give back that money, which they've long considered their own? But look, basically, that's the prospect. Or the second prospect is to stop the war. That's to stop the war. Well, and then if the war stops, it's clear that a completely different architecture will take shape. And the political landscape could change very quickly. And here, for Putin to lead this process, he would have to explain it. That is, he would have to fully activate the propaganda machine and turn everything around in a different way. But in principle, he could do it if it weren't for the issue in his head. The issue called Ukraine, and so he keeps going down this path. Look, I think that for him, Trump's statement about canceling the meeting in Budapest was like a slap in the face from Trump. I think he didn't expect that. For some reason, he was sure that he still had some time to keep dragging things out with impunity, making a fool out of Trump, leading him on, stalling for time. I repeat, stalling for time, to hold that meeting in Budapest, to once again tell him stories about the Ruriks and the Pechenegs, to once again make some outrageous demands and lure him in with things like so-called joint hockey games. He was sure he would be able to do all of that. Because look, he called before the decision on the Tomahawks had even been made. And look, it's not just me saying this. We've talked about this together. According to my insider information, there were going to be 10 Tomahawks. 10, not 100, not 200, just 10. Trump was already ready to send them everything. The logistics, everything was known, everything was decided, how to service them, everything. And Putin knew this too. And when it came to this, he stalled. Until the very last moment, on Thursday, on Friday, they were supposed to hand them over. In fact, that's why President Zelensky flew to Washington. And on Thursday, Putin urgently calls Trump and redecides everything his own way. Oh, what a clever guy. You know, he managed to pull it off again. Once more, he spun Trump around his finger, and Trump listens to him. And now the decision about the Tomahawks is postponed, and they start talking about meeting dear friend Vladimir. Look, it seems like everything was working out for Putin, but there's one thing he doesn't understand. Trump is no longer the same Trump who even welcomed him in Alaska. Now, even he himself, he's very angry at Putin. And his inner circle, they treat him, you know, with a kind of barely concealed but still obvious hatred, which they don't even bother to hide when talking in off-the-record conversations. So, of course, right now it has come as a complete shock to Putin, a real cold shower that Trump is saying, A, I won't repeat Alaska's mistake again. You won't make a fool out of me anymore. This means that before we meet in Budapest, our teams, and why not Vitkov but Rubio, because Rubio is a hawk, our teams led by Rubio must agree on the agenda down to the letter so that it doesn't turn out like it did in Alaska, remember? Trump actually walked out. He was confused, disappointed. He gave him the red carpet, he gave him a hug in the back seat of the limousine, but in the end he walked out and he couldn't understand how anyone could refuse what he was offering because he was offering him truly luxurious terms. And of course, he was so upset that they didn't even feed Putin in the end. He didn't cancel all the joint flower laying ceremonies, which was supposed to be for World War II veterans and so on. Now, having learned from bitter experience, he said, I'll only fly to this meeting when our teams have agreed on every single detail. What are we going to present to the press? You have to do this, 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 and this. And the main thing here was the condition that Trump set was a ceasefire. In other words, after the meeting in Budapest, we had to come out and you had to say, that's it, I'm stopping everything. The fighting stops and we begin the peaceful negotiation process. Of course, no one knows how long these negotiations will last, how it will all go, what will happen. Well, naturally, no one knows this, no one can predict it, and where all this will lead is also unclear. But what Trump wanted to get from Putin was to sell his meeting as a ceasefire achievement. A complete ceasefire. That's exactly what he, if we remember, started with initially. Remember, he said, first a ceasefire, then we'll work out a peace agreement. No problem. Okay. But a ceasefire. As we understand, this moose, I almost said horse, Lavrov, did not agree to that. And after talking to Ruby just lost it. Look, they're kind of holding themselves back, but I can see what's going on inside. The team's reaction, yeah, when we're talking, at first they were even afraid to say anything bad. When it comes to Russians, we discuss everything openly, without hiding anything, and talk about who is worth what. But at first they were like that. Well, I'm talking about my own experience here. I'm sharing my experience with our viewers right now. Yeah, at first they would all speak using polite, politically correct words, very carefully and cautiously. Well, those who support us at the same time, they also understand who the aggressor is. But at first it was all kind of respectful, and then somehow it all became more neutral. Now they openly express their opinions about them. In other words, they're already on our side. They went through this process very quickly, and now they say that these people are completely incapable of making agreements. They are absolutely, unhinged people who think they can do anything, and that their nuclear club is the guarantee of everything. They think they can wave it around endlessly, and that because of it, they can dictate any terms they want. And this already annoys the Americans. It pisses them off. And of course, when Trump saw this, he just went ahead and canceled the meeting. And then he just went ahead, just like that, without even announcing it, because before that, remember, he said, well, now is not the time for sanctions against Russia. So he keeps playing this game like over there, it's all blah, blah, blah. That's why I say, don't listen to what Trump says, watch what he does. Remember, I always tell you that because if you listen to him, you'll all end up depressed. You'll all be constantly angry, constantly upset, drinking, taking some kind of sedatives. So don't listen to him. You can turn him on, just watch him if you want, but then read about what actions were actually taken, by his administration, his department of war, as he now calls it, finance, and so on. So let's look at the actions. And the actions are as follows. 2 days before this, Trump says it's not the time for sanctions against Russia. And then the finance minister comes out and says that there are these two companies called Lukoil and Rosneft. We're imposing sanctions against them. And the next day, Trump comes out and says, drill, baby, drill, we're opening everything up here. In other words, he's changing the rules of the game, you see, in the oil market, in the global oil and gas market. And this, of course, I want to tell you, is a particular trait of Trump, his unpredictability. In some cases, that's a downside, but in others, it's an advantage, and he really can be effective. So what I want to say is that Putin really didn't expect this. He's at a loss. I don't know if he's panicking, but listen, they have all the information over there. You and I are only analyzing based on indirect evidence, based on certain signs, and also even on what they officially release. I mean, their financial structures. The Russian ones are saying that they're in deep trouble. Well, let's not forget what their finance minister said. There was just a forum in St. Petersburg, supposedly an international economic one, and what Nabulina kept saying all the time. So they were sounding the alarm to Putin, even back in the summer, already in the public space. They were warning that if Putin didn't end the war by the end of summer or the beginning of autumn, let me remind our viewers, Russia's economy would collapse. What does a collapsed Russian economy mean? We can keep speculating about that. So he went to the oligarchs to take their money. Well, first of all, he will certainly take money from some, but others will clearly resist. In other words, within the country, he himself will provoke the creation of an opposition that will fund certain generals, whether they're unhinged or not, some liberals who will immediately appear. Look, the fact that right now we don't see a single liberal voice inside Russia actually means nothing if you know Russian history. Because as soon as the right conditions arise, and as soon as someone starts pouring in big money and feels empowered, and if one of the FSB factions inevitably supports it, then events can unfold at a kaleidoscopic speed. You see, this Swan Lake moment we've been waiting for could come sooner than expected. And in principle, the West already, judging by my conversations, for the most part is no longer even afraid of the potential breakup or disintegration of Russia, because they understand that the intimidation that Putin began to employ en masse against the Baltic countries, for example, against Poland, against Romania, and other countries neighboring Russia, Finland, and so on, could escalate into something bigger. And everyone is already fed up with it. These Russian fighter jets in the skies over NATO countries, they're irritating, you know? That's why, of course, they all understand that Russia, in its current form, won't leave them in peace either. And so the question is what to do with Russia. Well, our answer is obvious, clear. Listen, we've been telling you this since day one. Change the regime. The regime in Russia must change so that Russia stops being a threat to national security, to the whole world, in fact. And ideally, if things go well, Russia should break up into several countries, into separate, different states. By the way, these regions already consider themselves oppressed. They've been waiting for this moment for a long time. They've been ready for it for a long time. It's just that nothing has come together yet, you see, because basically this is an empire that is bound to burst. And I want to tell you that now I see more and more people in the West who understand this, who are not afraid of it, because they were also afraid, remember, of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even the Americans, they didn't want the Union to fall apart either. And why? First and foremost, because of nuclear weapons, the same old nuclear weapons. Bush came to visit. He came to our Verkhovna Rada to persuade Ukraine by all means not to seek independence, not to separate, and so on. But that no longer depends on anyone. You see, these kinds of processes, when they are set in motion historically, no longer depend even on the will of the biggest players, because it's a kind of historical inevitability.
Yes, you are absolutely right, as you said. And here is a very important point. When we meet next week, there will be a meeting between Trump and Xi in South Korea ahead of us. The 30th, October 30th. This is a very significant event. Many China experts are saying that this meeting could actually determine the fate of ending Russian aggression. Let's definitely discuss the fact that Chinese state oil companies are now in shock. And they, following the Indians, just these days, they have suspended purchases of Russian oil precisely because of the sanctions against Russia that Trump imposed on Rosneft and Lukoil. So now both India and China have had their state companies suspend oil purchases. But this is a very painful blow for Putin. And what do you think? What could Xi and Trump agree on in South Korea, and will they reach an agreement? This is a very important topic, I think. It is
the most important thing, because without Xi's support, Putin wouldn't have been able to continue the war for so long. In other words, he wouldn't have been able to wage it by now. Given how the situation is currently developing, and again, considering how former President Donald Trump has essentially modeled and shaped it, this upcoming and highly anticipated meeting between Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping gives us every possible chance and opportunity for President Xi to dopi. Let me put it this way. Well, not that he would start supporting Ukraine, but that he would stop supporting Russia. We have every chance for this to happen, for Xi to stop supporting Russia. And what does that mean? If Putin loses revenue from oil and gas, those oil and gas revenues, and then China also stops supporting him, just imagine, friends, what Chinese support really means. It's not just direct military support like drones, we all know and understand this, and also spare parts and components for targeting systems. Without China, those missiles and drones wouldn't be able to reach Ukraine in such numbers. But beyond all that, it's also crucial support in the form of Chinese goods, starting with military uniforms and clothing, for Russian killers, occupiers, for the military-industrial complex, and even down to food supplies. So this includes food supplies, including rations and absolutely everything else. You see, it's clear that this benefits China because they've simply found a huge market for their goods, dumping all sorts of products of such quality that no one else would buy them. They don't even want them in China itself. To buy, to own. Listen, Chinese-made cars in China are generally only bought by the most backward, the poorest, and the least fortunate people. I occasionally watch videos that people post about daily life in China, and in those videos you can see that the majority of people who purchase these vehicles are those with very limited financial means. There are a couple of Ukrainian women who moved to China a long time ago, and they run their own blog from time to time. It's tough there with the internet, tough with all of that stuff. But nevertheless, they keep going, not often, but on various topics, talking about life in China, how everything is set up there for their own audience. It's very interesting. So, what do they say? The thing is, Chinese cars, Chinese-made products in China are generally considered, if you drive a Chinese car, it means your life hasn't turned out well. In other words, something is wrong. All the cars, even the parking lots, they constantly film the parking lots near, just right here by the houses in this neighborhood, in this city. All the cars there are brands, we know. That is, they're all different, from Toyota to Mercedes, Lexus, and Ford. But as for Chinese cars on Chinese roads, you very rarely see them. And this is considered, let me repeat, I already said that. But they found a great sales market, Russia. And in Russia, people actually buy Chinese cars, because if you compare Chinese cars with, compared to the quality of the cars currently produced in Russia, like those vans, Lada Kalinas, and some Zhigulis, a Chinese car will look like something ultra-modern and high quality, because those vans are already coming off the assembly line rusty. Do you see what I mean? And there, where the speakers should be, where the music is supposed to play, it's just stuffed with this, not with foam, but with something like cotton wool. Well, that's footage from the dealerships. It's not like I'm making this up, friends. You can probably find all of this online. But people go in, get outraged too, film it, and post it online. So just imagine what a favor Russia is doing for China. A huge market where they can dump these Chinese cars that nobody else wants, even for free. They don't even buy them in China, you know. But Russians are buying them because, I repeat, things are even worse there everywhere. I mean, right now they can't produce anything themselves at all without the Western machines that have already broken down, without technology, without high quality parts. Everything with them, it's like they have hands growing out of their backsides, you know? So we're coming back to the point. Look, without support from China, both military, industrial, and economic support, well, Putin, he'll just collapse. And it's very realistic that Trump could get Xi to do that. And here, Trump understands perfectly well that if he manages to do this, it will happen much faster. The goal he set to stop the war will be achieved.
So it turns out that next week is very important from a geopolitical perspective because everyone is waiting for this meeting. For some reason, everyone thought that first Trump would meet with Putin in Budapest, and then Trump would fly to South Korea to talk with Xi, but that wasn't the case. As they say, Trump surprised everyone with sanctions instead of a meeting. Next week, Alesya and I will meet right after, so to speak, the meeting between Xi and Trump to discuss it while it's still fresh. And Alesya will immediately give a full breakdown of the results of the meeting. I think it will be very interesting. Friends, support our tandem. As always, we are here for you. Despite blackouts, despite the lack of electricity, despite the situation, Alesya and I still come out every week to discuss current military and political events. Please like this video and in the comments, write a few words in support of our tandem. Alesya, you always get so many compliments. You can't even imagine. I read them with great pleasure. The one and only, the famous journalist Alesya Batsman. Alesya, thank you so much and see you next week.
Thank you, Dasha.